village board special meeting related to an environmental scoping session. We will begin with the pledge. Please join us.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Alrighty, this is a very special evening. Who is acting as clerk? Do we need to take attendance for this, or is that not necessary tonight?
I'll take the roll quickly, Mayor.
Thank you, Stuart.
Trustee Quezada.
Present.
Trustee Lopez.
Live.
Trustee Levin, I did see before, but I'm not seeing her showing up on my screen.
You will in a moment. She's there.
Okay, that's fine. I'll count that as a here. And Mayor Garrity.
Present.
Okay, we can proceed.
Very well. Thank you very much. I guess I will turn it over to who is going to be our Master of Ceremonies leading off this discussion this evening.
Mayor, I'll do that with Simon running the slides. We have about 8 slides just as an introduction for both the trustees and members of the public.
Thank you. And by way of introduction, folks, if you haven't been tuning in regularly to our meetings, that gentleman on that square right there on your screen is Frank Fish from BFJ. And we also have Simon Cates here with us in person at the hybrid meeting at the community center. They are both from BFJ Consulting, which is the firm that has been working with us on our comprehensive plan. Thanks so much, Frank.
Right. Well, Simon's going to, I think, share a screen and get these slides up. But yeah, while we're waiting for that, I'll just introduce the idea of scoping. Oh, here we go. That's fine. I think it's better to just these. So it's a scoping session which fits into this. No, that's fine, Simon. You can go to the next slide. It just fits in. I'd like to just show a context of where this fits in. We're with the master plans, or comprehensive plan steering committee, now about 70% through their working draft. And you can see the comprehensive plan material up on orange in the slide here. And the update is due to be completed by the committee. That's before it's sent to the trustees. And that's in blue, by October. And then once the committee is finished and reviews everything, public comments on November 17th, the plan is to send that draft plan to the trustees. Also, we're working on some zoning, and that draft zoning will be discussed with the trustees again later in November. So we've got a plan coming and some zoning updates that go with the plan. So state law requires, and this is all in yellow, that you do comply with the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which for short is called SEQR. And that process has begun. The trustees have begun that. You declared yourself lead agency for the environmental work. You also received a Part 2 environmental assessment form. You identified in that that there are some issues here. If the plan were adopted, you would like transportation looked at and impacts on the school system looked at. And those are now reflected in what's called the scoping document. And that's what tonight's meeting is about. I want to indicate tonight's not a workshop on the plan or the zoning. It's not so much a Q&A. It's really just to explain the scoping, and that's what these slides are about. So I'm going to try to do that right now with the next slide. So we've got a plan that this is the plan chapters. With those chapters are basically we're through about really 7 of those that have been sent through to the committee now, and these are all going online. So we're getting to a point where we need to review the environmental impacts of those chapters and what's being recommended. And I think the next slide goes through just, we're working on sort of 3 sets of zoning updates. One is on the T district, the 2-family district. One is an idea suggested by the village planner and also with our site visits, and that is the creation of an multifamily 3 district. And then the third are, which we've gone through with the trustees, is the downtown and Croton Avenue sort of form-based zoning approach. So there's 3 zoning code issues that'll be eventually reviewed by the trustees. So these items, these items need to be reviewed, and the trustees have now gone through the environmental assessment part 1 and 2 forms, and then the trustees made what's called in September a positive declaration. That is, you want to do a full environmental impact statement, which is your choice to do and is provided for by state law. And you made that determination, so the first step in doing an EIS is scoping. And what is scoping? It really just is a document that outlines the contents of the EIS. And scoping is now required by state law. This meeting tonight is actually not. State law just requires a comment period, but we always feel it's good to have an actual session so that everything can be explained. So,
Frank, while you're mentioning that, I want to clarify, you mentioned before that this is really more of a presentation than a Q&A, but if anybody is tuning in and did want to ask questions, we did incorporate folks having up to 4 minutes to be able to ask any questions or comment.
Oh, sure, yeah.
We don't always say that, but for tonight we are. So.
No, that's fine. And once we finish the scoping, and scoping remains open, by the way, till, and Stuart, please correct me, I think it's until October 16th. So,
correct.
Yeah, if you want to send in, anyone who wants to send in a written comment to the manager's office or to Jaime Martinez, the planner, feel free to do that. And then final scope would be authorized by the trustees. So that's what scoping is, trying to outline the EIS, and then we'll proceed with the EIS. So hopefully toward the end of the year, when the trustees get the plan and the draft zoning, they'll also have what's called a draft environmental impact statement. And the word generic here just means area-wide. It's just it's to distinguish it. This isn't site-specific to any project. It's just a draft environmental impact statement on the comprehensive plan and the zoning amendments. So then that allows the trustees eventually to hold a hearing on the plan and the zoning and the draft environmental impact statement. And after that, you would have then the trustees have the opportunity to make any revisions they would like. Questions at the public hearing that revolve around environmental impacts have to be answered in what's called the final environmental impact statement. And then once you comply with that, you're free to adopt or revise or reject the plan or the zoning as the trustees see fit. But no final action, state law says, can be taken until you really go through this SEQR process. So tonight is the first step in the EIS process. So Simon, I think we can go. So here's the actual, I like this chart because one, it's not ours, it's the State Department of Environmental Conservation chart that just explains the process that we're in. The trustees have already done the EAF. They've met all those requirements. Tonight, scoping, you can see in yellow here, just to have a discussion of what the contents of the EIS. Once that's done, we can prepare the EIS, and then the trustees will get the draft. The trustees have to review it and determine that it's complete, meets the scope, and then a public hearing can be held. Public hearing is not actually required by SEQR, but it is required to adopt the plan or the zoning. So we suggest that you have a public hearing on the DEIS also. And then, as I mentioned, you can see the timelines there for a final environmental impact statement. And then after that, just so the trustees know, after the final environmental impact statement is done, you can use that and the record to create what's called a finding statement, which guides your final actions on the plan and the zoning. So that's the overall SEQR timeline schedule. And then just the EIS itself goes through what you've determined to be impacts in that Part 2 EAF. And based on that, we want to look specifically at impacts on traffic and on schools. And then, Simon, I think we can go ahead here. So what is scoping and the purpose of scoping? I just want to, I think the state has been, in sort of one sentence, which we've quoted here, you can see it. The primary goals of scoping are to focus the EIS on potentially significant adverse impacts and eliminate consideration of those impacts that are irrelevant or not significant. So far the trustees have identified the traffic issue and any potential impacts on schools. Now, these may or may not, will evaluate them in the EIS. And so these two will be really identified and are identified in the scoping document. Now, the draft scoping document, as is mentioned here, can be downloaded. It's online. It's really a 9-page, not very long, it's a 9-page document. And it just outlines the contents of the EIS, which I think, Simon, if you go to the next, here it is. We've tried to summarize the scope in sort of one, just one sheet. And this is required, this organization is sort of required by state law. We have to have, by the way, this sounds inconsequential, but is not. The cover sheet is very important in the EIS, identifies who the lead agency is, the agency making the decision, and that's the Board of Trustees. And then it involves, it then has dates on it and also who the involved agencies are. There's an executive summary, which usually is section 1. Section 2 just briefly describes the proposed action, namely the adoption of the comprehensive plan and the zoning amendments that I mentioned before. Then chapter 3 is a key chapter because it goes through the environmental setting of key elements and the potential impacts. And then if there's some mitigation that is necessary or needed in judgment of the trustees, then that's included. And you can see here there's basically 4 sections of this EIS, land use and zoning, because zoning is one of the things being proposed in the comprehensive plan. And then the traffic issue and the schools issue that trustees have identified. And then there's an overall infrastructure chapter just to cover floodplain management, water, sewer. Item 4 is something required by state law. It's called by the state other environmental impacts. They are things such as irreversible and irretrievable commitment of resources. There's been a big argument over the last decades since SEQR was adopted is exactly what that means. So there's different ways of handling that. So the state outlines those. And then section 5, chapter 5, alternatives. The state law just suggests here that we need to evaluate what happens if no action is taken. If there's no comprehensive plan and no zoning adopted, what is that baseline issue? And then finally, chapter 6 gets into, are there any subsequent actions, SEQR actions, that we want to identify? For instance, if we identify if some zoning changes were made and a specific development came in under those new zoning changes, one of the things we would normally specify is that development's responsible for its own environmental assessment form. This is an area-wide document we're doing, so it doesn't get site-specific. So for any particular site, we're not going to know about pollution on the site or drainage on the site or the best access points to the site. So that's what Chapter 6 is about. So that is the scoping outline. And again, we've taken about 8 pages in it. And I wanted to just show this schedule at the end to simply remind me to say that scoping, you can see in the middle of those yellow bar charts there, we're at the beginning of the EIS. So this is the beginning of it. People will have a chance to comment on the actual finished document at the public hearing. So tonight is just really to outline the EIS, and that's the purpose of tonight's meeting. So, Mayor, do you want to? We're finished with the presentation, so it's just a matter of if you want to moderate the comments and questions, and then Simon and I and Jaime can do our best to answer where it's appropriate.
So before we take down the presentation so we can all see each other better, can you skip back to where you list the 3 zones that we're looking to modify? One of them was the T zone, one of them is a newly created MF3 district. Okay, so we've talked about this before, but it was pretty early on. Some detail of what would be different for the potential development or improvement of properties in the T zone. And one of the things I really liked about it is that when it was initially outlined, I feel like it was organized differently, and maybe it's got all of the same elements, and I'm just not recognizing how it might be presented differently. Maybe you could explain a little bit more about the MF3 district.
Sure, yeah.
You mentioned that it says right here it's contextual to the T district, but
it's an idea that came out of the site visits we did with Jaime Martinez, your planner, and it's the idea that the T district, we can make some modifications in the T district. An easy one to mention is the T district actually doesn't allow a 2-family home as of right. So we thought in a 2-family zone you ought to allow a 2-family house. So we're making some changes in the T district that we've gone over with. It's in our sort of initial land use and zoning chapter, but was pointed out to us that there may be other infill opportunities around some of the T districts or around downtown, where we might want to allow, and by the way, in our parlance, I don't mean to throw out new terms, but there's a lot in the literature that talks about the missing middle. What they mean by in housing, what they mean by that is between single-family homes and your existing M1 and M2 zones. Those are they allow fairly substantial multifamily buildings. And there's nothing in between actually in the Ossining code that we identified. And so the MF3 is looking at allowing, still within the heights of just 3 stories, not going higher than that, getting a contextual development in some of your existing streets, like Aqueduct, for instance, was pointed out to us, and also to allow some townhome development, again, all within 3 stories, sort of 38 feet, to see if infill housing in areas that already have that density, that MF3 district might be a good transitional district between the downtown and either the T district or single family districts. And by the way, this is an idea, and it's something that once you have, you'll be, we're sending the text of this right after our meeting Tuesday. We normally have just a informal meeting with the manager and with the planner. We'll send that to Stuart and to all of you for review. It is an initial draft, but that's what the MF3 is about. I think the other downtown, we've had that sort of tutorial or sort of study hall on the downtown and Croton Avenue zoning.
Frank, I'd like to add one thing on the
Sure.
MF3, and it relates to that word contextual. You have, as Frank mentioned, you have an MF1 and an MF2 in your code, but they're very suburban in nature. They require very large lots and large setbacks from the street, which doesn't work well in these T district areas, these transitional zones that are adjacent to the downtown. And so one of the things that we're saying here is that our idea for the MF3 is more similar to the T district than it is to the MF1 and MF2.
And the other thing here, Mayor, and thank you for the question, and I forgot to mention this, it's right on the slide. Our thought was to propose this to the trustees for your consideration only as a text amendment to the code, so that, not to map it, that to give you the option yourselves, if the plan is adopted and if the zoning is adopted, and this is your choice, if this MF3 zone is adopted, it doesn't mean that we would map it anywhere. We would expect perhaps some applications for it, or you yourselves may determine where you might want it to go. So it'd be your decision. We're not suggesting it be mapped anywhere at the present moment.
Okay, so the way that the T-zone is being presented, 2 families would be as of right. There could be a 3-family by special permit. By
special permit.
And then the MF3 district is not necessarily going to be recommended as existing in any and all T-zones or otherwise. Okay.
That's right.
It's just an option where we could say, well, there's actually 4 neighborhoods that are currently part of our map that are T-zones. And some of them, it might make more sense, I would imagine, to have an MF3 district incorporated into it. Is that what pulling this out allows us to do, is to determine exactly what neighborhoods, because there are some neighborhoods that already have this type of development that you're talking about. And so it would actually be very consistent with some neighborhoods to be able to allow for this.
That's right.
Okay, so whereas some of our T-zones might really just be 2 and 3 family homes, and so it would be out of place or just not as welcome an addition, right? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, that's basically right. That's.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Okay,
and,
great.
That was my one big question as you were going through the information. So do others have questions?
Simon, wait. Oh, sorry, I was going to suggest, Simon, if you could leave up scope itself, the 1 page on the scope, so people, the actual content of the scope. Yeah, so there's the what scoping is to agree on the table of contents. What's going to go in? What are we going to cover in the EIS? And these are the chapters we have to cover by law. But I just want scoping is about getting comments on it.
Can I ask a question, please? So those on the previous page, those are the recommendations by whom? And are those the only recommendations that we will be looking at in this process? In other words, if I see something that is missing, so it's not whether I agree or disagree with the 8 bullets, but what if there's something on here? You refer to the trustees recommended, but in fact, it is not all of the trustees, just a semantics thing here.
Oh, sorry, right.
Yeah, that's okay. That's just, I think, needs a little cleanup. So how does that work?
So if I can kind of jump in here right now. So I think it's important to sort of differentiate a little bit between what we're doing tonight, which is really focusing on getting the parameters set for the environmental review, and what we haven't done yet, which is present some recommendations to the steering committee and eventually to the trustees to see if they're something that people agree with, that are good ideas. So, you know, part of the kind of academic exercise of developing the comprehensive plan is, you know, coming up with some ideas of ways to change it based off of the feedback and comments that we've gotten from, you know, whether it's the public, the trustees, or even, and this is,
no.
You lost me?
Oh, never mind.
Yeah.
I don't hear him.
Others can't apparently. I can hear you, but I don't think that they.
So Frank can hear me, so it's definitely going through Zoom. So it must be a local
Now I
issue.
hear you.
Okay, so I think the important thing with this is that as regards to the T district, a big part of the RFP initially to get a consultant together for doing the comprehensive plan was focusing on trying to come up with solutions for the T zone. So again, these recommendations, or I guess this information that's being placed here is not necessarily what the final recommendation is going to be. It may be, right, if it ends up that this is something that is generally agreed on as the right, is farther away from this than we have right now. But this is sort of an iterative process, right? We're kind of in the middle of it right now. So these are not the recommendations that are coming through. They may be, again, but we're not at that stage just yet.
So Jaime, help me understand this, and probably the FJF staff also, because I want to say maybe a month and a half ago, the BFJ came in front of the village board in a work session and sort of presented one of these ideas, which was the T-zone, and they were supposed to go in front of the CompPlan steering committee and present this. And Omar, help me out on this one. I don't recall having that conversation at all or having that discussion. So I see you nodding. So yeah. You agree with me?
Yeah, we haven't had it.
Yeah. So to me, if this is the scoping session, for us, more like look at it overall and some sort of recommendations. To me, these 3 items should have been part of the conversation with the steering committee, and kind of agreeing with that and having an idea, because we went through the downtown. So there's actually, I was talking to another member of that, and I'm going to be asking for an additional work session meeting / hopefully next week or the week after, before our regular meeting, to go over some of the stuff into the downtown and what does that look like in regards to changing some zones, updating some of that stuff. So I figured some of that stuff, it was already bedded out. The part that I guess I'm trying to understand, because I was going over the MF 1 and 2 zones over the weekend, and you said the MF3s will be just as part of the code, but not really defined anywhere within the village. So it becomes more like an interpretation of whoever sits on those chairs that will determine what looks good in those areas that there may be a potential for that. So I'm not sure it's clear, and it's not sure what that looks like to me. So until I understand, I guess, better, I won't be in support of any of these, at least the 2 that you guys have in here.
Manny, I can understand. Just a couple of things on what you commented on. I should maybe take a step back on the zoning, just to let you know, at the beginning of this process, we had and I'm glad Stuart's on the call. We had a discussion with the building inspector and with Stuart. We thought that there are a lot of zoning items that the building inspector identified that are, they have to do with definitions, with conflicts in the code, with house cleaning issues. And those he and Stuart and Jaime are working on separately. And for instance, the wetlands ordinance, well, Jaime got some advice from us that was something that he was doing with Stuart and the building inspector. So we're not involved in those, but we are involved in what was, as Jaime mentioned, was in the RFP, or RFP to us and our contract. What we were asked to do was to look at the T district and the downtown, and we've done that. What came out of the T district a bit is this idea that, we should not, the T district, there are parts of it that might be better if they were another district, or some of the properties near downtown might be better if they were another district. So we've developed this MF3 concept. We are sending that to you and the trustees within the next few days. I thought it was a little premature to send it just before the scoping session because it might confuse things, but those drafts are done. We'll be sending them out. We see that and let me address your second, you had another point that the comprehensive plan, the steering committee is just that. It's a comprehensive plan committee that's provided for by the state regulations on comprehensive plans. It's not a zoning advisory committee. So we see the zoning as going right to you, the Board of Trustees, and that's what we were going to send it to. After sending it to Stuart, it would probably come through Stuart, but that's the difference here, that we've been asked to do kind of two things in our contract. One was the comprehensive plan, and that's why you have a comprehensive plan steering committee, because the trustees appointed that. Second are these, they were really two zoning issues for us to look at. They sort of morphed into three, which I think makes sense, but we've got to go through that with you. And we have a zoning session coming up with you that's been scheduled. And that's where we would be going through all of this with the trustees.
So, Frank, thank you. And so let me ask you something. So you say you looked at the T-zone. So, and literally early today, I was talking to Jaime in regards to the T-zone as well. So what happens if you have a non-conforming use of a T-zone where it's a light industrial use? So how do you maintain those areas in an MF3, I guess? Because that doesn't support, unless by me reading this, it just doesn't support a light industrial portion of this or anything to do with anything like that. What I'm looking at here is a lot more residential than anything else. So again, I'm looking at the T-zone, and especially in downtown, I'm going to be very specific. Hunter Street. At the end of Hunter Street you have a lot of office spaces, you have a lot of mechanic shops, you have body shops, but isn't a T-zone.
Yes,
so you know, when you say you look, I mean, we can go into more details in another part, but I think, and you're right, the CompPlan is not about zoning, but it is actually, they are advising the board of recommending the board in some areas. That's the reason why we go walk downtown. That's the reason why we walk the waterfront. You know, that's the reason why we are doing this. It's not just to have them and do additional work. It's for them to review a lot of the codes, a lot of the zoning, to come up with different solutions in some areas or recommendations, and then bring those recommendations in front of us as well. So I don't see them as just a group. I see them as a very viable group that is very important for what we're going for.
Yes, I'm just making the distinction, that's all. What state law provides for in a comprehensive plan is a comprehensive plan advisory committee. That's what you have. And zoning is solely the jurisdiction of the trustees. You have not set up a zoning advisory committee. However, having said that, I just want to make the distinction. Having said that, it's perfectly okay for you to get the advice of the comprehensive plan committee on zoning, and we're going to send that to them also. But we're going to send it to you at the same time, because you are not only the lead agency for this, you're the only agency that can do zoning. But mainly what I wanted to suggest to you, just to make sure, I want to make sure we have this, October 28th, we have a whole work session, as I understand it, with you all, with the Board of Trustees, just on these zoning items. So that, I think that's a place maybe to discuss those in detail with you.
Frank, I think one of the points that we want to distinguish here is that as you know, in the T-zone in Ossining, we have a high number of pre-existing non-conforming uses. So whether it's disproportionately high number of multifamilies or that go beyond two-family, or some light industrial use, or in some cases, some heavy industrial use. And this may be getting a little off where we are right now, but one of the issues is how can we use the comprehensive plan, zoning, and environmental review to figure out solutions for those, if I'm getting that correct. That's what I think that we're sitting here trying to identify is that's a big problem for us. And it's something we've discussed a lot in the CompPlan steering committee. So this may not be exactly the right point, but that is something that we want to make sure gets addressed in the context of the overall comprehensive plan zoning exercise.
All right, so I'm going to try to jump in and provide a little bit of background and context. Can everybody hear me? Yes? It doesn't seem like my speaker's going through. I'm good? All right, Frank, can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. All right, great. So to give a little context to the T-zone, so at the beginning of this whole process, one of the things that was kind of really drawn out was that we have, in some parts of the T-zone, I think over 60% of the properties are existing non-conforming. And so, rightfully so, at the beginning of this process, when the RFP was developed, there was a decision by the Board of Trustees that they needed to have a comp plan, but one of the main focuses was fixing the problems that exist in the T-zone. And so there are a couple of angles that I think that we have tried to approach this at. One is finding a way to take existing non-conforming uses, which are at times challenging from a code compliance issue. We have certainly complaints and issues where some of these properties have turned into kind of slum-like conditions because of the fact that they can't be properly fixed under the code. And so you have, on occasion, unscrupulous landlords that will come and take advantage of that sort of hidden space where these properties are to try to find a way to get them to be more compliant. Along with that, we have other parts of the T-zone where there's some infill opportunities, but the code that it allows for infill only allows for properties that are built according to that code, which at this stage, for various reasons, have not been very interesting or attractive to developers to come here. So the T district fixes were an attempt, so far, in looking at it, to try to make some of what's already there now more compliant, some of what's there now work a little bit better. And the MF3 district, which is something that I think needs to have some time to sort of marinate a little bit more to figure out where it would work, is an attempt to provide kind of a catalyst for development, for infill opportunities in the village where it makes sense. And I think that, one of the things that's been clear throughout this whole process is that whatever is built has to be contextual, right? So the average house is, 2-3 stories. It's not very tall. The existing zoning allows in the T-zone for, I think, 35 feet. So this zone, the MF3 zone, would be about 3 feet higher and 3 stories. It'd be almost exactly identical to that. It allows for a higher density of housing, but what that allows you to do in the T-zone, which you can't do now, is you can put townhomes right next to each other. So in the T-zone, I believe you do have to have some setbacks from house to house. Some of the older housing stock, which predates the zoning code entirely, because a whole swath of the village, especially the area by Sing Sing prison, it is built around the 1900s, right? So a lot of that stuff is non-conforming because of that issue. This provides opportunities to do some of that infill. So again, I think it's important to note that we do have a sense that in the T-zone there's going to be some changes. Those changes aren't going to be use changes that we're looking at. So we're talking about going from residential to residential. Maybe there'll be some increase in the number of units in the MF3 zone where it is decided ultimately to apply it. There'd be an increase, but again, those are primarily going to be in residential districts, going from residential to residential. So for the purpose of the scoping session, I think that in evaluating the scoping document, it's important to ask, have they hit all of the key points in terms of what needs to be looked at as we go forward. So the zoning recommendations obviously have to go through a review that's specific to that. The comprehensive plan has to go through, essentially says, yes, as part of the comprehensive plan, we do want to see fixes to the T-zone district. We do want to consider some of these things, but they may not be the whole change. The adoption of the comprehensive plan is one thing, and the adoption of the zoning is another thing. It's going through the same environmental review process, but those are separate items, right? The comprehensive plan will be a document unto itself. The zoning code goes into the zoning code of the, or the zoning code text amendments goes into the zoning code itself. So those are, you know, separate and apart. In this process, though, it is important to note that, you know, we're going through this process together. So if there are elements of the suggested recommendations of the T district, and I want to stress that the changes that they're talking about can, you know, are being distilled down to 3 bullets, but there are some more specifics that come with this that deal with coverage, that deal with side yards, that deal with the number of units per acre. That, you know, there's a whole worksheet that gets into the details of this, and that's going to be detailed in the memo that is forthcoming from BFJ to talk about this. So it's important to vet that document once it's available, rather than the 3 bullet points, you know, or the 2 bullet points that we have right now, which are just not comprehensive enough. I mean, you know, for downtown and Croton Avenue, talking about allowing, you know, residential as a permitted use and form-based overlay is a really, you know, general statement about a very specific and far-reaching, you know, zoning recommendations that's going to come through. It's going to have a lot of detail to it. So that's the finest possible distillation of what recommendations are going to be brought forward. But again, those things need to be evaluated by the Board of Trustees ultimately to decide whether or not they're good. And they do have to go through the Comprehensive Plan Committee to make sure that they agree in general that it makes sense to provide for some of these code changes to clean up issues. But, you know, I think one thing that is undeniable is that the T district has a lot of existing non-conforming uses. It's just, it was one of the first things that was identified as we went through this process.
Thanks, Danny.
I want to follow up on something that Manny said, at least my take on it, that there are, as you said, these pre-existing non-conforming uses that enabling them to be that type of development to happen in a certain way as it's being presented here will make a lot of sense for all the reasons that have been identified. The thing that Manny was mentioning specifically as far as not just the size of the residential units, but the existing commercial and light industrial uses, in some instances, I don't think we want to, it might not be appropriate to only say pre-existing non-conforming uses for light industrial or retail or commercial are allowed. We might want to allow for, it might feel appropriate in some of the T zones to allow for light industrial or residential. Are we setting ourselves up for that to be an option, or it's just a matter of we're really focusing on any future changes, any future permission or development in the T zones to be residential?
I think, Mayor, a good way to perhaps handle this is we have the document on the T zone now in draft form, as well as for the MF3 district. Why don't we send that to all the trustees and the committee? But the short answer to your question is the recommendations on the T zone have primarily come out of, you know, our meetings with the building inspector, conversations with Stewart, conversations with Jaime, and they did not get into use changes in the T district. And if that is something that you feel the trustees would like to do, then we're open to that. We didn't hear that previously, or I didn't. So the short answer to your question is no, we didn't look at developing new uses such as industrial for the T zone. But if you would, you know, if you would like to do that, what I'd suggest is take a look at, we'll be able to get this out to you by certainly Monday.
Right. That would be great, because I'm not necessarily sure that I'm recommending that every T zone suddenly become a light industrial zone. So I don't want to misrepresent the question that I'm asking, but I also think that some of the existing ones that Manny was referencing, for example, on Hunter Street, you know, it can be an asset to the community, especially since we are keenly aware of, you know, the recommendation, in fact, from our housing needs assessment was to increase our commercial our commercial tax base to offset some of the demand of the residential tax revenue. So it's just something for us to be aware of where it might be appropriate. And so when you send us a document, I'll look at it more thoroughly. I'll ask another question unless one of my colleagues wants to raise their hand, or I do have a couple more questions, but I don't want to, I've already asked one. I want to ask about looking at the scoping. You know what, do we still need to look at the PowerPoint, or can we look at each other?
Oh, you can look at each other.
Okay, so can we need to pull it back up again, but if people have specific questions. But the question I have right now, I'm actually looking at the scoping document, which for anyone who looked at the website to find the agenda for tonight, you can click right on the hot link that's in the agenda. And I'm looking at page 7, the infrastructure and floodplain management. I'm going to ask you some of the same questions that I've asked before, and some of the same questions that we discussed when we had our Zoom meeting with the DC's Hudson Estuary group there, and the folks from the Cornell Climate Adaptive Design Studio. And that is, what is the source information? Because you just talk about sea level rise projections, which is what are the numbers that are used in most of the data sources. The one thing that's not incorporated there that we were able to confirm is that the data that was used in the Cornell study was drawn from Columbia, and that also incorporates the storm runoff, which is relevant to us because we have so much, we have hundreds of lots that are adjacent to our, not just the Sing Sing Tail, but other waterways like that are impacted by climate change, but not directly by sea level rise. And if we're only using sea level rise data, then we're not fully looking at the impact of climate change as it impacts all of our streams and waterways that feed the Hudson. And then my other question is related to that, since we're talking about the data in the floodplain. It's 2020 right now. We're using data for just 30 years from now. We're only going to the 2050s. You know, I thought it was actually a little bit conservative when the Cornell Adaptive Design Studio only went to 2080. When Manny told me that architects build for, buildings to last for 100 years. So why did you only go to the 2050s? And are you drawing data from the Columbia studies?
And I'll let Simon go into this in more detail, but the short answer to your question is yes, we are drawing the data from that you had originally suggested from the Columbia University studies, and that we've just sent to the committee an updated waterfront chapter with that data, with the Columbia data in it. So that is I wanted to just answer that. On the future datum, 2050 versus 2080, we can use 2080, it's all available. The reason for the 2050 is it's seen as I mentioned before, as something, if you're financing something or you're doing something, you want to know the life of the building. Yes, a building itself can last 100 years, but it's being financed for 30 years. And the 2050 just seemed to be reasonable on that basis. But if the trustees prefer 2080, we can put that in. It is less reliable, obviously, out that far. It's just less reliable. It's like doing school projections, if I may. The school projections are good. They're solid for the next 5 years because you generally have grade by grade projections and they're solid data. The projections to 2050 or to 2080 are based on a lot of assumptions. You have to go through every one of those assumptions and you have to assume that they're not going to change from 2020 to 2080. That's a stretch. So the further you get out with those projections, the less reliable they are. And we thought that 2050 was a good mean projection to use. We don't mean to either undercount or overcount, though. We have no, we don't want to, in other words, we don't bring to this any particular, if you want, we can put in the 2080 projections. But we don't want to, we want to put maybe a slight caveat that they could change next year with new, new data, that kind of thing. So it was just trying to produce a median, sort of projection for people that we felt was, one, a little bit more reliable, and two, it's what developers base financing on. They don't go more than 30 years. A projection out more than 30 years is difficult to rely on. But again, we don't want to, we can always put that in, or we can include also, by the way, the other problem here for us is eventually, each of these chapters has now become 20 or 30 pages. If you get 10 chapters, you get a 300-page report. So what we want to do at the end maybe is put some of the data, like traffic counts or that kind of thing, or maybe this data into an appendix. And there's where we can put in the 2080, we can put in 2050, 2080 data for you in the appendix. But otherwise, we're gonna have a pretty long, pretty detailed.
Yeah. If I
comes an encyclopedic.
Yeah, I want to just add two quick things. One is that just to follow up on one thing that Frank said, is that we had started off using the scenic Hudson maps, as I think you all know, and we took that recommendation and that preference for the Columbia data, and so we've replaced those. I believe the updated draft of the waterfront chapter is on the website on ossingingtomorrow.com, so folks can look at that updated version. The other thing I wanted to say, which is a discussion that came out of the waterfront subcommittee meeting, which is that whichever year you look at, whichever projection version you look at, the comprehensive plan recommendation is fairly similar, which is that you have a lot of parcels down by the waterfront that are currently at risk for flooding and will be at risk for flooding in the future. And so from a comprehensive plan standpoint, the outcome is about the same. You need to start mitigating and come up with policies to mitigate for that risk. Now, is it going to be one parcel versus the parcel across the street? That's where, as Frank was saying, there's uncertainty. We don't know exactly which parcels are going to be impacted. But the comprehensive plan recommendations, in terms of the type of mitigation that you need to start doing, are going to be are important one way or the other, and so that's what we're looking at in that chapter.
Thanks. That's all really helpful, and I'm really excited that you're using the data that we talked about, and that it's also consistent with the data that we spent so much time learning about when we were part of the Cornell study. So thanks a lot for that. But for me, when what we're talking about here is long-term planning. And I don't look at it through the lens of a developer. So for me, it's not a matter of a 30-year investment. It's a matter of inviting something to be built in our community that's probably going to last a lot more than 30 years. Where there aren't too many buildings in Ossining that last less than 30 years. And so I would be interested in using data that's 2080 is also data that we're familiar with from the Cornell study, but to me, it's still a lot more conservative than looking at the next 100 years. So that would be my preference, and I think that I've now exhausted my list of questions. So I will just look to my colleagues and hear what else we have, and I'll take a look and see if we have a couple of attendees if they have any questions. Rick, I think you had something to ask or add.
I did. Let me just make sure I unmuted. Okay. So I find this really, really helpful. First of all, I appreciate all the work that goes into it and your commentary about how many pages each chapter has and the totality of it. But if I may just step to about 30,000 feet up in the air and not get into the individual bullet points, I think that what would be beneficial to people reading this, even as we go chapter by chapter, and it's in its final stage, and then for 10 years after that, because the ideal is to update comprehensive plans about every 10 or so years, is that without that half-hour conversation of what we're doing here today and what scoping is, if all I did was look at the written material, it is quite different than what I've now learned, having sat here for probably an hour. nobody's going to have the opportunity, and frankly, even as lovely as this, as a video might be, people don't have that opportunity. So if I might suggest a way to elevate the delivery and the curating of this information, so not only do public servants understand it, or those that are in the profession, but actually everyday people, you verbally refer to there's a problem and this is a solution. You verbally talk about how, you know, we interviewed the planner and it's the village. So some of the syntax and the lexicon, I think, would be more helpful to actually in the documents, assuming that there will be an overall document that says, you know, here's the problem, here's the solution, here is the problem we're looking at, here's the solution that has come up, and to delineate visually where information comes from. So what's still missing for me, and I know you're going to deal with it, is the public engagement. And what's still missing for me is understanding where you got this information from. Like, I'm not sure I agree with the stated problem. I'm not sure when I was supposed to be involved in the problem. And I know that people filled out surveys and did stuff, but when I go on the website, I can't find the results that you then used to draw conclusions. So some of this more scientific sort of approach of problem solution would be helpful. You could do it even pictorially. Had you written here that where we got these 3 bullets is from conversations with the professionals, because that's what our staff is. They're the professionals. It has a different shade to me than implying that it was not the implied, but I may read it without the context of this conversation and say, oh, okay. So the elected officials and the public and the professionals brought this to the attention of the consultants who then opined on it. That's actually not where we are, nor did you say it was. Therefore, I think some of the putting things and framing them, not as if you're speaking to a developer who knows what you're saying, or elected officials who some know more than others. I'm certainly never the smartest person in the room, so I have to sometimes, you know, listen to others as well and understand what they're hearing that I'm not. But the presentation of this material and a plan that we presented that will inform the public. I never ever thought of the comprehensive plan as informing developers, because I don't represent developers, I represent the public. Is a little bit missing. And therefore, we find ourselves having these half-hour-long back and forths every time we meet, by the way, explaining to us what it is that you put in the document before we get the actual content that we're supposed to look at. So I would just rethink a little bit how it's community presented. And when the public does get involved, you could switch from the color green, for professionals gave us this input, to the color green and blue, that we also invited stakeholders and the public, so people have a sense of it. Because in about 8 years from now, when somebody sits on the planning board or any of the land use boards, what I find that they do today is they're told to look at the letters, at the bullets, at the lists. They rarely go back and look at the intent and where the information came from and what the actual intent was. Not to say that they're not told to do so. Not to say that they weren't trained. Most people don't have the time. So I'm loving what you're presenting. I just think the context and the framing needs a little bit work, because I learned a long time ago that when you do a presentation, every page has to tell a story. And when I look at the page by page, it doesn't tell a story. It needs like a verbal half-hour explanation. And that's still not great to me. And I know you're going to get there. I'm not even worried. But I just wanted to give you that as an input and not go bullet by bullet. Secondly, what I would like you to help me with is, like, how does one have input into it? So I go on the website, you have till X, Y, and Z to write to us. But I don't get a sense of what you get and what you did with the information. Not in these meetings, not when we walked around town. So I don't know how to get that, but I do think there has to be documentation of the input so that we are able to say a year and 2 from now, you know, there were 42 people at a meeting that discussed, and another 18, and so 483 people had input, from professionals to developers to everyday people. I think it adds vibrancy to a very important document that you're spending so much of your time on. So that's my 30,000-foot sort of commentary that would enrich the work that you're doing for the community, not for the professionals who know exactly how to read these kind of documents. And I thank you for the work. I very much enjoyed the walk, by the way. You know, seeing our community with you guys was, I'm just sorry I can't do it more, to be honest with you. It was just terrific.
So, Rika, first I want to say, you know, that's a really great point about trying to connect the conversations and the input that we've gotten to the stuff that's coming out of here. I will, you know, say that when you talk to professionals, I think, you know, certainly when you talk to me, when you talk to, you know, Karen, when you talk to anybody else who's been involved in this process, and really I speak for myself, a lot of this information is through conversations that I've had with other people throughout this process. So, you know, we've seen that there have been issues with the way that the zoning works in the downtown, for instance, the VC district, where there are requirements that require you to have ground floor retail in every single instance. And that doesn't necessarily work. And we know that because, you know, property owners have come to us and said, hey, I need a zoning variance, a use variance, which is extremely hard to get, intentionally so. And that's just a byproduct of the buildings not really conforming or working in the way that the VC zone was written. And so those conversations informed discussions that we had with BFJ that ultimately informed discussions that we've had with the comprehensive plan when we did that walk about, you know, coming up with form-based code that worked, a regulating plan that didn't require, you know, ground floor retail on every single place within the VC district. You know, those same conversations were had with other property owners who, you know, have issues down by the waterfront, or not by the waterfront, but I guess it's a Station Plaza area where they've had issues, or where we've seen development not really take place over other years because people have come in and had concerns about, you know, different things. So those comments and conversations do, you know, factor into I think every recommendation that we've tried to make, as well as, you know, with BFJ, you know, we have the fortunate benefit that, you know, if there's been, you know, there are like 42 municipalities in Westchester County, and BFJ has probably worked on half of the comprehensive plans in the county. So, you know, they do have a lot of context that they're able to bring in, and they've worked really hard to try to get that. But we, you know, we do need to make sure that we're clear about that when the comprehensive plan is going through, and as we go through this process, connecting those early on conversations to that. So that's a really good point, and we'll make sure that happens.
Well, I'm going to add something, and I just want to point this out, Jaime. You're sitting, like, I would say exactly 12 feet from me, probably, or 15. It's different points of view, and when you hear this recorded back, what you just said, I would just say that, to me, the comprehensive plan is about people in the community. It was never my understanding that the input is really about the landlords and the developers and all that. They're simply one group. So, and I'm not saying those are the only people you're speaking to. I see you at like 100 meetings. I mean, I don't see you. I hear that you've gone to this and that. It is missing from this, is all I'm saying. You would enrich all the work that all of you are doing by making it clear that you spoke to different people, and it doesn't have to always be in a public meeting, that it happens every day, and that this is the whole problem solution thing that was stated earlier does not at all, for me, come out in this document anywhere. And nobody's going back to read some RFP that the village wrote to consultants. They're just not going to. And I'm not thinking what happens when we vote on it. My desire is to think about this somewhere between 5 to 8 years from now. Like, in that time frame, will people then really understand the document, go with it, and not just bullets? That's all I'm saying. I'm simply pointing, and I know you're agreeing with me. I just think you guys don't do yourself enough justice in some way by understanding, like the community wants to look at it and go, wow, okay, I get how you got here. I get the journey, and I sort of understand the intent. And when I sit on a board of whatever, I got to look at the intent as much as I got to look at the bullets and ask questions. And that, I think, will make like super vibrant land use boards that will work with you guys because you've done all this work, frankly. So I think we're in agreement. I just think that the focus needs to be, for me, it's about the people in the community, of which developers and landlords are parts of that.
Trustee Lopez. Oh, go ahead, Frank.
I was just going to say we totally agree with you on the focus. The focus should be the community and people in the community, and I think I can say to you, Rika, that we haven't met with any developers. We've met with all kinds of subcommittee members, and our whole emphasis has been representing the community. This has to be your plan. We agree with you. We agree with you on it.
Trustee Lopez, you have a virtual hand raised.
I sure do. Okay, thank you very much, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Frank, and Simon, thank you for coming to the crown jewel of Westchester, Ossining, New York, here in person. You are welcome here now and always. So my question is the following. My understanding of what we are doing tonight is that the GEIS and all of the rest of the kind of environmental impacts of these kind of zoning changes that we're looking to make fall into this relatively narrow band of work where, for example, different parts of the village like Sparta are not included in this. This is really trying to address specific problem areas that we have identified over the last decade that there are kind of spot solutions for in planning and zoning board of appeals and all kinds of places that it's come up that there is a pattern that has emerged that where somebody says, if only there were a more comprehensive way to address these issues, and it seems like this is a good way to be able to solve many issues at once with the addition now of the MF3 part that Jaime added in. I have a comment on that and then a question. So the comment is, my sense walking into this is that certainly you are all working within the system that exists. It seems almost intentionally obtuse with terms like T-zone and MF3. It's like, why can't you just say what it is? If it's multifamily, call it multifamily. And if I want to short it, I'll call it MF3, but call it what it is. It seems intentionally obtuse. I know you're not making it that way, but all of that leads to it reinforcing the technical nature of a lot of this work, which can make entering the conversation as someone that does not have a planning background rather difficult. And I think that underscores the deputy mayor's point that for the public that is trying to make sense of a process like tonight, a document like this, there's not a really easy entry point. There's an assumption of knowledge coming into a document like this, which may or may, it's probably consistent with what happens if you Google scoping session or GEIS, which I did like 10 minutes ago. It's a lot of these kinds of documents, and this is not dissimilar from what happens everywhere else. But it's my first time encountering it, and so it's surprisingly dense for me. Okay, so considering all of that, my question is, you mentioned earlier, Frank, that the table of content represents the standard pieces of the document there, and the question, as I understood it, is what else might we want to include, or what might make sense to take away, given the fact that this is kind of the standard approach. So I'm going to actually ask the question back to you. From your experience, what are elements that may be either missing or that other communities choose to include? So for example, what I saw was that a bunch of particularly in that fourth chapter or so that says schools and transportation, whatever else, that tends to align with a lot of the chapters that we have in the comprehensive plan right now and that we're writing out. But what's not in there, for example, is economic development. And so how do these changes in zoning impact the businesses that are around? That may make sense to include, it may not. But the larger question is, what is it that needs to be included that is not?
I think a good way to maybe, and by the way, first I should say that you're not the only ones that find a session like this one, scoping, to be, it's first, we find also, it's very, the language of the state law, the format of it, and so on, it does, although the Department of Environmental Conservation itself says, oh, a layperson ought to be able to fill out the EAF form, and a layperson ought to be able to, do this and that. But actually, it helps to have some comparison. Scoping sessions are very difficult, I find, to, explain to the public what it is. But let me try and answer to your question that what we should do in an EIS is, if you, the trustees, feel that, and that's why we went over part 2 with you on the EAF, the key to the Environmental Protection Acts are identify what might have a significant adverse impact to the environment. So that's what an EIS is kind of about. Otherwise, you don't have to do one. In other words, I love to use this example of Bronxville. They always say to me, we've done 5 of their plan updates, and I know the answer going in. They would never adopt a comprehensive plan if it had a significant adverse impact, period, so they never do an EIS on it. However, they don't make they don't have issues that a lot of other Westchester communities have. And for instance, Jaime went through and I should call it, by the way, I agree with you, I would just call it the 2-family zone. People would understand that. And you could call the MF3, it's multi-family infill zone, maybe, just, call it by the English language.
By the way, I think the silliest zone in Westchester County is probably the DMX zone in Yonkers, aptly named, or followed up maybe by the dirt zone in downtown, which I think Frank is familiar with both of those.
Yeah, I'm familiar with both, yeah. Yeah, but Omar, I think if I could crystallize this, we should be looking in the EIS at an area that, and we wanted to be forthright about this, we will make some, if you do make some changes, let's take the downtown zone. To me, that's an easy one to understand. We do have a suggestion that you all know, we've walked it now and we've outlined it with you, that perhaps you could add by special permit, within the overlay district, if somebody opts in, you could go from 48 feet, which is allowed now in height, to 58 feet, another story, a 5th story. Well, that has impacts. That one we perceive to have some impacts. It could generate slightly more housing downtown. That's a possibility. Now, once you do that, what would that have that might be an adverse impact? I think there's a lot of positives to it. It would help your retail merchants. We discussed this on the walk through downtown. But what are the adverse impacts that an EIS ought to look at? And, it could generate a very slight amount of more traffic. And we've been sensitized to the school district concerns about students in the school district, which is why we spent a whole section of the infrastructure chapter on the schools. So we thought, that's why we, in part 2 of the EAF, pointed out, yes, a slight more units possibility could have an impact on a school district. So we tried to identify what we saw as something that might be an adverse impact, and let's, study that. Now the EIS, by the way, a long time ago in SEQR, it was originally worded that you might have to do an EIS if you had a significant impact on the environment. And it didn't take the state that long to recognize that that was the wrong thing to do. If you have a beneficial impact on the environment, why would you analyze, why would you spend your time on an EIS? So if that slight additional floor might have a beneficial impact, that's not a reason for doing an EIS. The reason for doing an EIS is where you might have an adverse impact. And what we've identified so far with you, in that part 2 is these zoning changes, particularly downtown, I don't want to overdo this. I think the impacts, when we examine it, we need to get through this scoping to know what we're examining, will probably be relatively minor, but the law says you ought to know those impacts. And so we would study those impacts. And that's what this scoping is really about, is there's something else, the public feels you missed, or we missed, or jointly, then that tonight's meeting is about that. The two we've identified so far are those two. And again, the two-family zone really is aimed at trying to eliminate some of the nonconformity. We're trying to, you'll see this, we're trying to, at the building, after meeting with the building inspector, we're trying to make the side yards work a bit better. We're trying to make parking work a little bit better. And we're trying to eliminate some nonconformity by allowing that third unit, a three-family, only by special permit of the planning board, because there's so much in the the two-family zone that is nonconforming. And so that's, Omar, I hope that's the focus of scoping.
That is helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we may have a question from one of our attendees in the community, Timothy Foley. I'm going to click to allow you to talk. And so now it's up to you, sir, to figure out on your end. There you go. You unmuted yourself. Welcome.
It's not my first Zoom. Thank you very much. So my name is Tim Foley. I'm actually speaking on behalf of the Executive Director of the Building and Realty Institute, because we represent a number of home builders and commercial builders who have projects before the village from time to time.
Excuse me, sir. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Mr. Foley, could you just say who you're speaking on behalf of? I missed some of that. I'm sorry.
No problem. It's the Building and Realty Institute of Westchester.
Thank you.
And among our members are home builders who work within the community. So first of all, I just want to say we greatly appreciate the collaborative and community-driven effort to strengthen the village downtown center district in the Croton Avenue corridor. We think the code there is definitely in need of revision and a careful consideration. And we particularly think the T-zone district deserves the same level of scrutiny. We have two specific comments on ways that the scoping document might be improved or might be expanded. So first, there have been a number of form-based code updates within Westchester County, including most recently Portchester, who implemented theirs just this year in May. And the experience of our builders who have worked with that new code have largely been positive, but there are always some unintended consequences. So for example, I believe one of you already mentioned, there are always concerns when there are variances needed right away, even if the code's been crafted carefully, to deal with issues like setbacks that work in residential zones but are impractical in a downtown environment. So we would like to suggest that in the development of the scoping, it might be a good opportunity to take stock of what other communities have needed, including what they needed and perhaps didn't have lined up at the launch of the new code, in terms of waivers, training of building departments and other staff to quickly address those unintended consequences when they arise. And then the second thing is, I know the scoping document goes into great length about the socioeconomic conditions like population projections and potential for displacement, gentrification, all those elements that typically get studied. I think we would want to argue that the affordable housing needs of the village now, not just for additional population down the road, are equally important to have into the conversation. So the Westchester County Housing Needs Assessment published last year found that the village has a higher percentage of households that could be labeled asset limited and income constrained while employed, or ALICE households. And that's a measure developed by the United Way to identify households that do not fit the official definition of poverty, but still struggle to make ends meet financially. The village has more of those households than does Westchester County as a whole. Ossining also has a higher percentage of residents that meet the traditional definition of poverty than Westchester as a whole. And within the village's present-day housing stock, it found 25 households that are substandard, 270 that are severely overcrowded, and 2,204 that are severely cost burdened. So part of the answer to that, we feel, must be removing some of the barriers that prevent the housing to meet that need from getting built. And we think it's worth exploring whether there are ways to address that as part of these present-day affordability questions and the other socioeconomic factors within the context of the scoping document and the revision of the comprehensive plan, including this GEIS. So those are our two comments.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think that some of the questions you raised have been part of the consideration and the driving some of the recommendations in the T-zone. So can any of our planners speak to these questions?
Yes, and Simon, please add in here, or Jaime add in here. Some of the things we're looking at in the T-zone, as we mentioned, are first, allowing it to be a two-family zone. So allowing a two-family as of right, so that you don't have to go through a process with the planning board, which simplifies the case. And also, then we're looking at you have some what I find in answer to Tim Foley's comment about other communities, and Jaime knows these very well. One of them is the Fleetwood section of Mount Vernon. They have just for single-family homes in that section in Fleetwood, they have side yard requirements that are not as tough as the ones you have in the two-family zone now. And we're making some suggestions on those side yard requirements because we think it could help property owners, because a lot of properties are, as you know, non-conforming from the maps we did for you. So we're looking at that as a second issue. The third issue is parking, trying to get a little bit more flexibility on where you can park on the lot. And then finally, the fourth issue is to, in some instances, give the property owner who already, for instance, may have a three-family unit, or when that third family is not, as you know, allowed right now, to go before the planning board through a special permit process. And if they have that, and the planning board feels, look, they have the parking, they meet reasonable requirements here, then there's an ability to get that unit to be conforming. And we think if you have a conforming unit, it may instill in the property owner sort of incentive, if you will, to improve the property. We know there's a lot of absentee landlords, and that has been an issue in Ossining. So we're trying to, with the two-family zone, to get some incentives that will reduce the amount of nonconformity and give some incentives to pick up to rehabilitate some of the buildings.
The MF3 district that's been proposed is also directly speaks to the potential for greater affordable housing development in some of these neighborhoods, right? Depending on how that might be incorporated. Yeah, it's made. It's really a district that is made as an infill district, or a district that could also allow some townhomes in it at a fairly low, again at a 3-story level, not to the extent of your current multifamily 1 or multifamily 2 district. One of them allows a 6-story building. We're not allowing that, but we see the multifamily 3 district as something you're missing right now, and it could be a contextual infill district and a tool that the Board of Trustees could use, say once the plan is adopted, because you need a plan where there's being conformance with it, to get this type of housing, which would offer, it would affect, I think, Mayor, the affordability in a positive way. Great, thanks. Go ahead, Karen. Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, no, I just wanted to address the fact, Tim, thank you for your comments. One of the things that predates the county housing needs assessment is Ossining's housing needs assessment that was done, I think, a year or two before the county did theirs. But looking at, Ossining was very proactive in looking at their housing needs, particularly their affordable housing needs. So, as the mayor had mentioned, one of the linchpins of looking at planning and updating the comprehensive plan is really making sure that we are addressing affordability in a more constructive way, in a way that provides more quality housing, and in a way that, to Frank's point, limits the ability of slumlords to take advantage or have substandard housing. That is a very poor and often not very affordable substitute for what people perceive affordable housing is like. So thank you for those comments.
Great, and also thank you, Tim, for writing in the chat, because it wasn't clear exactly how you might be able to ask a question. And so sometimes people can raise their hand. If you can't raise your hand, then go ahead and you can comment in the chat. There's a couple other attendees right now, and I'll give everybody a moment to frozen? Huh. No? Maddie says I'm frozen? Maddie says I'm good. Okay. Oh, technology. All right, there's two other folks in the attendee box there, and I'll just give them a moment if they want to. I'm not seeing anything. I've been rambling about them for at least 30 seconds by now, so they might have written in the chat if they wanted to ask a question. So then, is there anything else from my colleagues on the board or in village government that you wanted to ask or clarify while we are here with BFJ and with our staff? All right. Then, Jaime, is there anything you wanted to just finish off with? You're good? Okay.
So let me try this again. All right. So you know, one of the things that we're lucky with, I think, here in Ossining is that we do have, we allow as of right in various different areas multifamily housing. So what the new zoning stuff that we're looking at will enable us to do something that might work a little bit better in some of these lower residential districts that you do see as an infill project in other municipalities, which are the sort of the two-family owner-renter unit that is affordable infill. So, you know, a lot of times if you're trying to get affordable housing built, you're looking at a 4% tax credit deal, which has to get close to 100 units, or 9% competitive tax credit deal, which is still going to require, you know, 50 to 60 units. And that's not always going to work. But the affordable housing sites that are trying to do some small infill ownership units, which I think is something that is you know, I've heard is very much supported in this community, that people do want to see more affordable home ownership units. Those are the kinds of things that could very easily fit into the MF3 zone as of right. And so the best thing that you can do as a municipality to say that you support affordable housing and try to enable it to be built is to have an underlying zoning code that enables it to come in as of right, right? Because if you're a developer and you're trying to go into a municipality that doesn't support affordable housing, a lot of the times that's done through the zoning ordinance. So they'll say, we're not going to allow any multifamilies, and you have to have 1 unit per acre, and that just sort of makes it impossible for the development of affordable housing. So when Westchester County is looking at where they're going to spend home dollars, they want to know that, you know, a developer has a real project, and once they have the ability as of right to come in and build that project, then they'll step in and support it. So developers, you know, can now look at Ossining. Even right now, they could look at Ossining in certain places and say, hey, you know, we think we have a good affordable housing project. And I think that, you know, certainly these zoning changes are going to continue to support that. Although I would note that, you know, I don't think we only need affordable housing in Ossining. We need other stuff too.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jaime, and all my colleagues. Was anybody else have any more final questions or comments? Are we good?
I always do, but I'm gonna wait until actually I see the comments from the recommendations of the TSON and the changes, because I just went over what we have and what Portchester has and what Peekskill has, and I have a bunch of other questions, but I'll wait.
Okay, man, he's gonna grill me in the parking lot probably. You know, pin me down.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thank you to the members of the community who joined us as well. And as was mentioned, this scoping period, is going to be open until I believe it was October 16th. So if anybody has any written comments for us, go ahead and send them to the Village Management Office. You can also send them to the BOT at villageofossining.org. The village manager is Kay Dottori at villageofossining.org, and we'll make sure that those are incorporated into this scoping session, which will then culminate in a public hearing, correct? And that.
After the DEIS is produced.
Okay, that's pretty far down the road. Yes, that's pretty far down the road. So if you have questions.
Well, hold on. Wait, there's two public hearings, right? So there's a public hearing of the Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee, which is going to take place on October 20th.
20th, right.
And that's not just about what we're talking about now. That's much broader. Yes.
Yeah. And then the EIS public hearing is going to take place after the draft has been done.
Great. So many more opportunities, but anybody who's paying attention right now may have questions right now, and the sooner you get them in, then the better able we are to know where the community is, and then how that might be able to, their concerns and priorities that might be able to be incorporated, and maybe something we're not thinking of. So thanks everybody. Do we have a motion to go into executive session, or no? We're just doing advice of counsel.
Just advice, maybe.
Okay, so then a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor? Aye. With that, thank you very much. We won't see you in one of these rooms for a little while. Our next meeting is not until Wednesday, October 7th. It is a fifth Wednesday next week. Enjoy. We'll miss you. Bye-bye.